Welcome back to another edition of AOBO Online. It's your host, Mr. Remke, and we're coming to you this time talking to the topic of automotive waste management. So in this particular section, we're going to talk about the proper collection, storage, and disposal methods of automotive waste. And then really, I'm kind of come back and talk about the environmental issues and regulations related to the waste itself. Auto shops generate a lot of waste, and we have to know how to properly collect it, store it, and dispose of it so it doesn't turn into hazardous waste and make some more paperwork and make some more hassles for us as the auto service center. So let's quickly talk about your hazardous waste generator status. So if your facility generates hazardous waste, you must comply with certain requirements depending on the quantity of waste and what type of waste you generate during a given month. So according to the Wisconsin DOT, there are basically three categories of hazardous waste generators. There are very small quantity generators, small quantity generators, and large quantity generators. To kind of boil this down, as an automotive facility, we make a lot of waste, but a lot of our waste has specific storage and disposal methods that then declassify it from hazardous waste and turn it into its own waste with its own waste stream and protocols to dispose of it. So our goal as an auto shop would be always to try to become into the very small quantity generator category because there's much more freedom, there's much less regulations, there's much less documentations, protocols, and procedures to follow. Every time you step up the chain, so go into a small quantity generator or a large quantity generator, which would be like a factory or a chemical creation or manufacturing company or some type of an industrial setting that uses a lot of hazardous waste. Every time you step up the scale, it gets more and more intense as far as cost, as far as protocols and procedures. So we are always trying our hardest to get into the very small quantity generator category. What I have here is a quick link to go out to the Wisconsin DNR's website, and it'll give you a really good overview of what is hazardous waste, what are the different generator categories, and there's even a link out there that you could click on to get the specific documents on really detailed about what is a small quantity generator, what's a large, what's a very small. So take just a few minutes, do some research, and try to figure out that there are different waste generator statuses, and each time you step up one of the categories, it gets to be a little bit more of an intense process. And kind of to recap, as an automotive repair facility, we are always trying to be in the very small quantity generator category, basically not generate a lot of acute or not generate a lot of hazardous material, but generate a lot of waste that can be properly disposed of and stored in different means and methods. When you get back, we'll break down each one of those types of waste that we could see in the automotive repair facility and talk about how would we collect it, store it, and dispose of it properly. See you in a few. Okay, so the first one on our list, and we generate a lot of this, is used motor oil. So this also, when we start to look in some of the details, we'll talk about other petroleum products like brake fluid, like power steering fluid, like transmission fluid. Really, used motor oil just cannot contain antifreeze coolant, gasoline, diesel, paint thinners, or solvents. So as far as storage goes and collection, typically we're going to collect our used oil or fluids in some type of a catch container or caddy. And then eventually we have to store that after the caddy gets full. So a lot of facilities will have used oil bins. Sometimes they're plastic and stored outside. Sometimes they're metal and they're stored inside. These will all be dual wall storage containment units. So it's basically a container within a container. So if the inner liner would get punctured, it would leak into the second container. There's always basically dual walls or dual containers. Some facilities do store their used oil in, say, plastic bins or 55-gallon drums. That does add a few little details that you need to know about there. Number one, toting those big things around are pretty heavy, so you typically have to have some type of a barrel cart. And the laws and regulations truly do state that if you're storing used oil in 55-gallon drums, they need to be stored on a secondary containment device. So that way if the bin would leak, the oil would leak into the secondary containment device and not spill or leach out into the ground. I'm assuming there's a few shops in the area not doing that, but looking at it the right way, we contain or catch our used oil. We store it in a couple different methods, either in an approved bin or in 55-gallon drums that are stored on a secondary containment device. And most shops have a lot of used oil, so we might even have to use multiple methods. So how do we properly dispose of used motor oil? There's basically two approved methods. Number one is to contract with a third-party approved vendor for disposal. These actually need to be certified through the state themselves as hazardous waste disposal companies. This is what we do here at school. We put all of our oil into a storage container, and then we pay a company to come by and basically drain it out of there and dispose of that oil and by the third-party vendor. A lot of facilities do burn their used waste oil to create heat in the middle of the winter. So instead of basically paying oodles of money per month or every few months to come and have a company dispose of it, we're going to dispose of it by a waste oil furnace. A few slides down the road here, I'll have you actually go click out on a few links out to the DNR and out to a few websites and learn about some details about used oil, filters, absorbents, and you will see in there that they clearly call out that a proper disposal method would be to burn it in approved heaters for heat, okay? All right, so what about used oil filters, kind of our second waste that we generate quite a bit of in the automotive repair facility. Beginning on January 1st of 2011, no person may dispose of a used oil filter in a solid waste disposal facility or basically turn it into your garbage to go to the landfill in Wisconsin. So that kind of changed the game. We used to basically some means of drain the filters, and we would honestly just throw them right in the garbage can at that point, and they would end up in the landfill. With them not being properly drained, with the cross-contamination of oil down into the water table and leaching into the ground, it was bad news. So Wisconsin came out and said that you may no longer dispose of them into the landfill. You more than likely are going to have to get a bin from your metal recycler and dispose of them that way. So storage of used oil filters is kind of important. Number one, they do need to be put into some type of a container that would allow the oil to be contained if they were to drain out of the filter. Disposal, filters do need to be drained in one of three methods. So gravity draining, which would be basically poke a hole in the top of it and let it drain overnight or for multiple days to let that gravity flow out. There can be disassembly, so you could actually take a cutter and disassemble the filter and drain it out, or crush it. I would say by far more than likely your facility probably gravity drains, but some of your larger ones that go through quite a few oil filters in a day may also invest in the very expensive oil crusher to crush the filters. We properly store them in a bin or a container, and then we normally have to dispose of those by turning them into our metal recycling, not just throwing them into the garbage can anymore. Okay, and kind of the third waste that I put into our presentation here would be used gasoline or diesel fuel. So according to regulations, adding gasoline or diesel fuel to a used oil storage container changes it from used oil to hazardous waste. Disposing of that particular hazardous waste, which would be neither the diesel fuel or the gasoline, would actually, the best means would be to go to a hazardous waste disposal facility, but there will be a cost associated to most of those businesses that try to do that. So to kind of sum up gasoline and diesel, I bet you most of you have taken a fuel filter off, drained the fuel line, and basically took that fuel and dumped it right into the used oil container. If we do that and it gets into a certain parts per million, it actually turns that entire oil storage container into hazardous waste. Then if you go all the way back to our quantity generator status, if we get a huge, large oil bin that is now considered hazardous waste, it may take us from a very small quantity generator to a large quantity generator, or excuse me, let me back that up, fellas, sorry about that. It may take our status from a very small quantity generator to a small quantity generator and step up our classification and intensify the process of paperwork, documentation, and of course cost. So to clearly make this gasoline diesel thing make sense, if you were to get used gasoline or diesel, it truly should be drained and stored in its own proper container and disposed of at a hazardous waste facility. The real world, fellas, it typically gets dumped into the used oil bin, it gets diluted, but when we're doing that, if we were to get to a certain parts per million, we would turn our used oil container into hazardous waste, and then it would have to be disposed of by a third-party vendor for a large cost. So just kind of understand this is kind of one of those hidden things that happen on a daily basis. But when you go through in the next couple of slides, you'll be clicking on some links to go out to the DNR and just kind of read what they explain as oil and what they explain as hazardous waste and what are absorbents, and you'll clearly see that in there. If we mix gasoline and diesel together in the oil bin, it is now hazardous waste. I didn't really know that right away, and it's kind of one of those I'm not sure a lot of facilities do. The last waste that we'll talk about before you go out and look at some links and kind of just research some other documents is antifreeze or coolant. So antifreeze or coolant cannot be mixed with other used oil or fluids. It needs to stay totally separated. So here's a nice shed that has its waste oil and its used antifreeze totally separated with secondary containment devices. We do not want to mix these. If we do, we turn them into hazardous waste. I would say by far most facilities contract with a third-party vendor to dispose of their used coolant, so you're going to more than likely have to pay a company to do this. Coolant must be stored in a proper approved containers. It may be a metal bin, kind of like these ones shown, or it simply could be a 55-gallon drum that is properly labeled. But most of the time, used coolant gets stored and then third-party vendor. There are some particular methods of recycling coolant in-house with a special machine and some chemicals. It used to be prevalent back in the day, but very unheard of. We're now paying a third-party vendor most of the time. Our last one before we do a little research is absorbents then. Another one of the wastes that we definitely generate a lot of. So oil-soaked rags or absorbents are considered hazardous and must be stored in a fireproof container. Absorbents may be thrown away in standard garbage if not contaminated with hazardous waste or free-flowing oil. So this is always one that gets a little bit confusing, but if you were to wipe up a small little oil spot on the floor, you would not have free-flowing oil in the rag. Basically, free-flowing would be if we go ahead and squeeze it together. If oil would run out, that's free-flowing. If it has no free-flowing oil, so we just wiped up a small spot and the absorbent had absorbed it, we are truly allowed to then throw it into the garbage. If we use a piece of pig mat, if we use a snake, that's obviously going to have free-flowing oil in it. Then it must be stored in a proper bin or transferred over to a 55-gallon drum type thing with a top. And we have to pay a third-party vendor to basically remove that and properly dispose of our absorbents. So absorbents truly could be shop towels, could be mats, could be snakes, could be pillows, could even be kind of that kitty litter style, the oil dry type one or oil eater. They all get absorbed into one classification. Funny joke there. But they kind of get classified together. And really to kind of break this down and talk about waste, number one, if it has no free-flowing oil in there, you can go ahead and just dispose of it in the garbage system like we would anything else. If there is free-flowing oil in there, they need to be stored in approved containers, and then basically contract a third-party vendor and pay dearly to dispose of them from there. I'm assuming this one gets cheated a lot in the shop environments too, where our used pig mats get thrown into the garbage. But you imagine how many shops there are in Wisconsin, how many shops there are in the United States. If everybody throws all these oil-soaked absorbents into the garbage system and that leaches into the ground, that's obviously going to be kind of bad news. So let's just take a few minutes here, fellas, and stop listening to Mr. Remke for a little bit. And I have basically 3 links for you to go click out on and kind of do some research. So the first one here is going to be a link out to the Environmental Protection Agency and some notes about used oil, how to properly store it, and how to properly dispose of it from the federal eyes. Then I have a link to go out to the Wisconsin DNR, and that's basically going to go out from the state eyes. How do we properly handle used oil, filters, and absorbents? And if you want to then, I didn't put links out here on the virtual lecture, but if you go into Blackboard and go into course materials, go into waste management, there's a whole bunch of other items that would relate to waste management and really focused on the oils, the filters, and the absorbents. This may take you a few minutes. There's some really good stuff. It's pretty easy read. So do that, come back, and we'll continue on and talk about some other waste that we generate, how do we store it, and how do we dispose of it. All right, so moving on to another waste that we definitely generate a lot of is tires. So tires must be properly stored to prevent the collection or puddling of water. That's obviously a breeding ground for mosquitoes or vector. So brutally honest, in some counties, they send around vector patrol or vector police. And basically, if you have a bunch of old tires stacked up, they're going to give you some warnings to properly store them outside, inside or in a proper containment facility so it cannot get water in them, and eventually they actually could give you fines. So to store them, number one, a lot of facilities will have some type of a shed, some type of an old trailer. Sometimes they do just get piled up outside, and honestly that is not the proper storage method of used tires because it could be a breeding ground for mosquitoes and other type of insects. How do we dispose of them? Most facilities use a state licensed transporter or disposal provider. This is where the old tire disposal fee comes in. Tires used to be relatively inexpensive, if not free to get rid of, and at this current state and time, most facilities are paying $3 to $5 or $6 a tire to dispose of them. Because there's a lot of tires that get generated and there's just not extremely great ways to reuse them without some cost associated. So there are, like I said, kind of to sum this one up, tires, we generate a lot of them. We have to store them so that way they do not collect water. And there is going to normally be some type of a cost associated to dispose of them. Sometimes if you do produce enough used tires, there are companies that will actually pay your facility for the tires and turn them into some type of like playground material or some type of recycled road material or something along that nature. But that takes quite a large quantity of tires and you kind of have to sign into a contract. So most people will end up having to actually pay to get rid of them. Take just a couple moments here and click on this link. This will take you out to the Wisconsin DNR's website and give you their details and criteria about proper storage and disposal of tires. When you come back, we'll move on to our next waste. Okay, so the next waste that we'll talk about is lead acid batteries and hybrid batteries. We'll start with lead acid batteries. So the lead that's inside of there, and of course the sulfuric acid, we can't just yeet these old batteries out into a hole in the back of the shop, and bury them in there. That would obviously be bad news to have that type of hazardous material leach into the ground. So lead acid batteries have a pretty straightforward storage and disposal means as far as the repair facilities go. Typically we buy the batteries from a parts supplier. The parts supplier charges us a core charge on the old battery. We return the old battery and get our core charge back, and the parts supplier takes care of the rest of the recycling process from us. So really batteries, if you look at this, when we purchase them from a parts store, the disposal means is kind of set up because it is required if they sell the batteries that they have a recycling or a disposal means set up or protocol set up through the parts house. So for us as shops, pretty simple. Buy the battery, turn in the old core, get your core charge back, and the parts houses take care of the disposal from there on out. Where this does get to be a little bit different is, let's say you just bought a new house, you went out to the shed out back and found out that there were 6 old batteries that were junk there. Then you would have to find a means of disposal, go to a battery retailer or go to a battery supplier and basically turn that battery into them, and they would take care of the disposal from there. As far as once the parts house takes it, once that battery supplier takes it, there's really some hoops and hurdles about how do they transport those batteries, what do they do with the old sulfuric acid, what do they do with the old lead. But for us as a repair facility, it's kind of out of our hands at that point, and the cost is associated to us buying the battery. So I got a couple neat little facts here from a student that did a little presentation on this a year or two ago. And I'd also like you to click on the link and go learn what the DNR says about proper storage and disposal of lead acid batteries. When you're done with that, come on back, okay? And we'll talk about these few last little details on lead acid and head into hybrid batteries. So once those lead acid batteries do truly get turned in to the collection facility, which is normally going to be our part supplier or battery supplier, there are multiple different ways that they actually can then dispose of that or recycle that lead. So there's crushing, there's sorting, there's sieving, and then there's this other processes, metallurgical processes. If you want to, you can click on this link and just take a little gander out there. Once that battery leaves the parts house or once that battery leaves the part suppliers, there's multiple different means of how do they separate the materials and what do they do for recycling it as far as lead acid batteries. Okay. All right, the next slide here has a nice little chart to show you non-hazardous batteries versus hazardous type batteries. Kind of what are the sizes, what would be their uses. So if you're basically just using simple old AA, AAA batteries, that's going to be in the non-hazardous, and those typically can just get disposed of right into the waste stream or into the garbage can. You're going to have to recycle or manage as hazardous waste multiple other different types of batteries, so that would be the lead acid, that'd be our nickel metal hydride, that'd be our lithium ion for hybrid batteries. So those are all then considered hazardous waste. Just a nice little chart to show you that some are considered non-hazardous, some are considered hazardous. Okay. So what about hybrid batteries? Hybrid batteries have kind of added in a new challenge to properly storing and disposing of waste. If you're looking at this, if you are buying a new battery, more than likely the OEM manufacturer will have a disposal program set up. It's a requirement if they want to produce the batteries. If you're buying a hybrid battery as a remanufactured unit, say from Dorman, they're going to charge you a core charge, so the disposal and the recycling process is kind of handled through the part supplier. Where this gets a little bit sticky is if you're buying used battery packs, or you would get a failed battery pack out of a car. How do you get rid of that one? And to be brutally honest, the question is, spend a lot of money. If you look at your hybrid batteries, typically with a label on there or somewhere in the car itself in the owner's manual, there will be a 1-800 number that you can call, give the serial number of the battery, give some other details, and the manufacturers will help you work through how do you properly ship and dispose of that hybrid battery or the electric vehicle batteries. Can get a little bit touchy though. Like for us here at school, we've taken in a few like used units that we don't own the vehicle that aren't 100% complete. And sometimes those OEM manufacturers will not then accept that battery into their waste program. So then you kind of have a big trouble out there. I have a couple links if you want to go out and look about how are hybrid batteries disposed of, how are they recycled. And just know most of the time it defaults to the original equipment manufacturer's program. You got to call that 1-800 number and work through with that manufacturer on how to dispose of them. Not something that you probably deal with on a daily basis, hybrid battery disposable. Not anything like it would be for lead acid batteries, but definitely something that as we start seeing more and more of these out there, going to become more prevalent. How do we properly store them? How do we ship them? And how do we dispose? All right, let's talk about a few last little waste stream things here and waste items. So light bulbs, something that we kind of take for granted on a daily basis, but some types of light bulbs will contain materials that are considered hazardous waste and can be harmful to the environment. So Wisconsin regulations are very clear on the storage and disposal requirements for fluorescent and bulbs that contain mercury, which are going to be our HID or high intensity discharge units. When you click on this link in just a few minutes and go out there, you will see that there are by far very set methods and protocols on how to store those particular light bulbs and how to dispose of them. And really the big factor that comes in is they contain mercury, and mercury is something that is very hazardous and become a very big safety issue. So those bulbs are pretty straightforward, okay? Typically, it involves taking those bulbs, like the fluorescent, like the HID, and disposing them at a approved waste facility. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward on those units. Where it does get a little bit dicey is the incandescent and the LED light bulbs. There really is no clear regulations on if we can just toss those in the garbage can or not. So brutally honest, that's normally what we do. To kind of sum up light bulbs, if you're working with fluorescent bulbs, you truly are supposed to store those in a box that is labeled used fluorescent bulbs and dispose of those at your hazardous waste facility in your county that you live in. Same thing with high intensity discharge units. Some of those contain mercury. So you should be storing those in a box, mark them used, contains mercury, or what type of bulb it is, and dispose of them at your hazardous waste facility. Most counties, if you're a resident of that particular county, you can drop those off free of charge. If you're a business that resides or is in that county though, they're going to charge you typically per pound to dispose of them. So now you can understand maybe, or just start to get an idea of why sometimes facilities have environmental fees attached to their repair orders. It's to account for costs for things like this. If I just go to change an HID bulb on a Cadillac or something, let's say that, or a fancy GMC, there may be a cost for me as the business to dispose of that old bulb. So I'm going to have to make sure I charge the customer that, or I'm going to start to lose money. Just something that you got to think outside the box once in a while. Once you take just a few moments, click on this link, go out to the Wisconsin DNR's website, and learn about proper storage and disposal of bulbs. When you're done, come on back and we'll head into another waste. So this particular one kind of piggybacks right onto that light bulb one, and it is waste devices that contain mercury. So mercury is a very harmful, very weird chemical structure. The devices that contain mercury sometimes are forgotten about. So as a way and means to publicize that there may be devices on board that contain mercury, a lot of manufacturers are putting these stickers in the door jambs now. This vehicle may include mercury added devices installed by the manufacturer, might have mercury in the rear seat video display, the navigation display, or the HID headlamps. So they kind of got smart and started to put stickers on there so we know we're there. Devices that contain mercury really probably are the most prevalent or the most worked with at salvage yards, scrap yards that take and destroy old cars. They need to remove all of the mercury devices and so that doesn't get scrapped and leach into the ground itself. So devices that could contain mercury would be navigation displays, high-intensity discharge headlamps, ABS accelerometers or G-force sensors. This one is always kind of funny, but some under-hood light switches that turn on the under-hood light itself. The switch inside that makes that work is actually a mercury device. So if you were going to go ahead and replace that, maybe that had failed and you need a new one, there's a small little mercury pellet that could be inside that particular switch, and it has to get removed, properly stored, and properly disposed of. Convenience light switches or dome lights are also another one that could contain mercury. So there are a few neat little articles out here about devices that contain mercury. Really the top one from the DNR is probably the most helpful, so if you want to take just a few minutes and go out and read about them, these are kind of unforgotten. If we take a high intensity discharge light out, it potentially could have mercury. It's not supposed to get disposed of in the garbage. It's supposed to get stored in its proper box, labeled, and then turned into the hazardous waste collection facility. So just kind of a one that may not be an everyday occurrence for waste that we generate, and it may be something that we even forget about. If we have a navigation display that gets cracked or goes bad, we can't just chuck that into the garbage. That may actually be hazardous waste. So like I said, just take a few minutes and kind of click on a few of these links and hunt around. The most important one for devices that contain mercury is right on top from the DNR. When you get back, we have just a few more waste items to cover. We'll show you the assignments for this particular section and we'll end this virtual lecture. Okay, so let's talk about parts washer solvent. Definitely a waste that we could generate in the automotive facility. It is considered hazardous waste. There are federal and state regulations related to parts solvents. There are basically two different parts solvents that are out there. There are what they considered cold solvents or halogenated, and then there are aqueous based. So the cold solvents, the halogenated ones, are the ones that really have the most regulations on top of them or on board because of how harmful they could be for the environment. So we'll talk about those first. Most facilities that use cold solvents will contract with a third-party vendor. They basically neither buy or rent the solvent washer from the company. And basically when it starts to get dirty or on a kind of a set schedule, the third-party vendor will come in, drain out all the old solvent and fill with new, properly dispose of that solvent when they're all done. So you're basically going to normally with cold solvent pay a third-party vendor to handle all of your means and methods of disposal. Some facilities, that has a very high cost associated with that. When they suck out your solvent tank, that's considered hazardous waste. So when they drive up and down the road with that truck, that's considered hazardous waste. That's an extra cost, that's extra insurance, that's extra licensing, that's state licensing. So there's a lot of cost that goes into part solvents. To avoid that, some facilities are switching more to an aqueous-based type solvent, and those don't always require the third-party vendor to dispose of them. So some of them actually have biological agents that are in there that once the solvent is used and dispelled of, they give you means and methods to basically add a considerable amount of water or some type of a neutralizing solution, and then you can just basically put your aqueous-based solvent down the drain. Not all of them, please make sure that we're reading into that, but to sum this up, there's basically cold solvents, there's aqueous-based, and normally we have to contract with a third-party vendor to properly dispose of those solvents. But there are some now that are coming with biological agents that give you means and methods of disposing it right at the shop itself. So, kind of sum this up and take a quick look. Click on the link, go out to Wisconsin DNR's website to learn about halogenated part solvents and how they should be properly disposed of. When you're done, come on back and we'll move to the next waste. Okay, so moving into wastewater and floor drain sludge. The construction of those floor drains for the automotive repair facility do have multiple state and local municipal regulations. In our area, most facilities require that it have a holding tank and not be attached to the sanitary sewer system. So in most of your shops in our area, you're going to have your floor drain where that floor drain sludge and the water and soap and all that stuff comes down in. And you are going to have basically a oil water separator containment device stored underground. This helps basically put the oils to the top, the sludgy stuff to the bottom, and separate it to be as clean of wastewater when we're done at the end as we possibly can. Some areas then, like I said, once we go through the separator, that wastewater would be put into a holding tank. And eventually, every so many times a year or maybe every so many years, we'd have to pay a third-party vendor to come in and contract out to basically drain our floor drains out, to suck them out with their great big suction tools on their trucks themselves, and basically then properly dispose of that sludge and wastewater. So in our area, normally when your water goes in the drain, it's going through the grate. It's going through a separator and then basically separating out the oils and letting that kind of sit as a scum up on top of the container or device and try to separate out the wastewater that goes into a holding tank. There are some areas that do allow you to have that wastewater get connected directly to the sanitary sewer system and disposed of in means and methods that way, but you're not going to find much of that in our area. Most of us that live in, say, Wisconsin for the most part, you're going to have its own separate separator tank and its own separate holding tank and pay a certified vendor to come in and basically drain out your holding tank. And trust me, you'll know if this is due because your floor drains will stink so awful bad if they haven't been pumped out recently. So just think about this though, that's a huge cost. That's probably at least a couple $100 minimum to have this truck come out. If you have to do that a couple times a year, that's a lot of money going out the door, and really you're not able to charge a customer a fee for wastewater disposal. It's something you have to absorb into your labor cost. So just kind of recap wastewater floor drain. Number one, you have some cost to build these devices into your facility when you make your shop. and you also have to pay so often for a third-party vendor to come pump them out. If you don't, then all that stuff comes up through the grate, and you have bad news from there on out. Let's talk about refrigerant. There's definitely a waste of old refrigerant that come through the door. So to kind of sum up refrigerant and go all the way back to climate control class, just remember to have technicians must be Section 609 certified to handle or transfer refrigerant. Most of the time, refrigerant is recycled on site, right in our refrigerant management centers. So when we hit recover, it runs through the recycling portion of the machine, goes back to purity standards, and then we basically just charge that back into other cars. So most of the time, used refrigerant is recycled right on site and reused into other vehicles. Back in the day, or if we get contaminated refrigerant though, it gets to be a little bit more of a intense process, because we would need to have a recovery only machine that could take out that used refrigerant or the contaminated, put it into a DOT approved container, and then we would actually have to send this off site for recycling or for disposal if it was contaminated. If you're dealing with just normal refrigerant, it's recycled in-house and really not a hard process. Setup kind of flows itself. If you're dealing with contaminated refrigerant or you're using a recovery only machine, then you need to properly store it in a DOT-proof container and send it off-site for proper disposal. That's considered hazardous waste most of the time at that point, so there's going to be some large cost. Refrigerant's a pretty straightforward one. Make sure your technicians are Section 609 certified. Make sure that you're using proper up-to-date equipment, J2788 approved machines most of the time, and it'll recycle that refrigerant right in-house. The only time this could get a little bit sticky is if you're dealing with contaminated, or like let's say you're working at a salvage yard and you do not have a recycling machine, it's recovery only, then you're going to have a little more intense process on how to dispose of the old refrigerant. Brake dust. Another one of those I'm sure Mr. Solberg covered very well, but brake dust is one of those automotive wastes that we just kind of take for granted. So there are multiple different ways to control that brake dust. So there are HEPA filters, basically great big vacuums with HEPA filters in there that would suck the brake dust up, put it in a collection device. We would then take that dust and properly dispose of it through a hazardous waste facility. Other facilities will use more of a liquid type of a means of disposing of brake dust. So you'll use your brake buggies or your brake caddies to wash down that dust so it doesn't become airborne. Of course, if you're dealing with a solvent-based, now you're having to contract with a third-party vendor to basically come in and exchange your solvent and properly dispose of the old one. If you're dealing with the HEPA vacuum systems, of course you have to have means to dispose of that brake dust, especially if it contains asbestos. And then this is kind of a nice little picture, and I'm sure you guys got to use these. That's why we switched in our brakes class to using these biological style parts washers. So it's considered an aqueous base, but the biological agent can be neutralized when we're done, and then basically lessens the intensity of what we have to do to dispose of that old solvent. So brake dust, kind of an unforgotten waste, but definitely something that we generate. Scrap metal and catalytic converters, something that we generate a lot of. So typically shops will have scrap metal bins, and our proper disposal means then is to contract with a third-party vendor, a metal recycler, or a scrap yard. And this one's kind of cool because most of the other waste that we have to store and then use a third-party vendor to dispose of, we pay for. And this particular one, they pay us. So the old scrap pile sometimes can make us money as a shop, not a lot, but hopefully not cost us a lot. They do need to be kept in bins, so that way when it rains and water comes out, that rust doesn't run down into the ground quite as easy. But normally pretty simple waste to deal with. You have bins, you throw it in there, you call your scrapper when it's full, they come pick it up and they send you a check when it's done. Just hopefully the thieves don't get to it in between there. Alright fellas, and we're almost there. I got just 3 last slides for you. So just kind of a question in your mind, and I never even thought about this one, but washer solvent. we generate a fair amount of waste washer solvent. What would be the proper storage means and what would be the proper disposal methods? This one came up a couple years ago through a class discussion in AOBO, and brutally honest, in my mind, I went, row. If I had a washer pump go bad, I would typically pull the washer pump out, a little of that solvent would run on the ground, I'd quickly plug the new washer pump in and wash that solvent down with a garden hose into our pit. It would get sucked up, and then eventually after I got my teaching job, I went, ooh boy, I was an environmental naughty person at that point. I don't have any proper means, any proper methods, any type of super great literature on this one, but just one I thought about. Washer solvent. There's probably a lot of shops not properly disposing of this, just washing it down the drain. Eventually that leaks into the water table and could be bad news. Other ones that I never had really thought about, but if you look hard enough out there, not through the state but kind of through federal eyes, is aerosol cans. So if everything works right and you have enough aerosol propellant in this can, it should have enough force to push out all the liquid penetrating oil or brake cleaner or carb cleaner. And hopefully when you go ahead and throw that metal can in your scrap bin for the metal recycler, hopefully it's totally empty. But you all know that you get a can, you use it 2 or 3 times, it runs out of propellant. You can still physically feel and hear the brake cleaner or carb cleaner in there. We get mad, we say a few naughty words, and we toss that thing either in the garbage can or in the scrap bin. And there sits hazardous waste in that can that would not get properly disposed of. So just know that in certain states and certain municipalities, they actually require that you crush those old cans, and they make specific machines. So you insert the aerosol can, it basically has a door that comes down and it turns on a vacuum. It punctures a hole in the can, sucks out all the old hazardous waste and puts it in a container, and you can't see that because it's on the back, and then crushes the can down from there. Something I never thought about, but I just basically would chuck those metal cans in the recycling bin, and there was hazardous waste stuck in there. So just kind of open up your eyes. Sometimes, even though you try your hardest to think about all the waste, properly store it, and dispose of it, sometimes you get a rut row moment like Mr. Remke. Okay, so that's enough yabba gabbing. Basically, I just hope it hopefully opened up your eyes that, hey, we generate a lot of waste. We have to properly store it. We have to properly dispose of it. And there may be some real big costs associated to that as well. Something if you're a business owner you'd really have to think about, or if you're a manager. Let's go through our assignments and let's end this virtual lecture. Assignments for waste management. Number 1 is going to be to post an article on the discussion board or a question. Assignment number 2 is reply to a classmate's discussion board post or question. Assignment number 3, renew your SP2 automotive pollution prevention credential. Okay, so let's take a quick look at that. If you go out to Blackboard, you go into the waste management assignment folder, you should see the SP2 automotive service pollution prevention assignment. I have the login instructions. So basically, if you click on this and open up the PDF, it'll give you the means and methods of your username and your password to log back into SP2. I'd like you to log into SP2 and review the information within inside of pollution prevention, and then take the final exam and earn a passing score. If you feel confident that you know this information well and you do not need to go module through module, slide by slide, and review the information, I'm okay with that. Your account is set up just to log in and take the final exam and hopefully earn a passing score. Once you do that, go ahead, attach that certificate into Blackboard for credit, and you will basically complete the SP2 pollution prevention. Those certificates are only valid for 1 year, so we're just trying to get those renewed and make it so when you leave the program, they will still be valid for you. Okay, and another assignment that we have for the waste management section is to complete the hazardous communications, or the SDS worksheet. This is basically going to be a 2-part assignment. First part of the assignment is to find the safety data sheet for the assigned chemical that you have been given. So when you log into Blackboard, go into assignments, go into the hazardous communication worksheet, there's a chart with everybody's name here and the chemical that you were assigned. I want you to go out to the World Wide Web, find the safety data sheet in the PDF form, and save that. You will need to attach that to Blackboard when you go to submit this assignment, so that's step number 1. Step number 2 is to fill out the AOBO Hazardous SDS Worksheet 2016. So basically you're going to open up that Word doc. There are questions in there, and you're going to find the answers to those questions in the safety data sheet that you found for your given chemical. Fill out all those questions. You can go ahead and type right into this Word doc, attach the Word doc, attach your safety data sheet, and that's your hazardous communications assignment. Okay? Once you're done with that, the last final assignment for the waste management is to complete the final exam. So log in, use your resources, complete it, and we should be good to go. Thanks for paying attention. Thanks for playing along in this AOBO online course related to waste management, and we'll see you next time.